time for the Longines Chronoscope. Our distinguished guest for this evening is the Honorable Joseph R. McCarthy, United States Senator from Wisconsin.
I will never avoid giving the facts to the American people, Mr. Huey. It's so easy, you see, to talk about communism generally, to talk about the sellout in China and Korea generally. But unless you call the roll of the traitors, unless you call the roll of those who have been responsible for the suicidal foreign policy, it's a waste of the speaker's time and the audience time. And I don't intend to ever get up and, in general terms, talk about treason, talk about sellouts. You see, foreign policy isn't like little topsy, it doesn't just grow. Treason isn't like little topsy, it doesn't just grow. It's created by men with faces and men with names. And I think those of us who have been elected by the American people to man the watchtowers, unless we have the intelligence to recognize the traitors, and unless we have the guts to name them, we should be taken down from those watchtowers and should not be representing the American people. And I don't intend to ever avoid giving the names of traitors, giving the names of communists when I discover them in important positions.
So they had set up this an investigation supposedly at Fort Monmouth, so I got there and got a hold of the lawyers and so forth, and found out there were 33 cases. Well, Joe had been talking this up. You know, he looks like he's going to crack the world's greatest spy ring and so on. So I did my investigation, went to see these people, and the charges were even flimsier than most reading the Daily Worker, or I knew somebody who had gone to school with somebody else who was thought to be a communist. It was really the dregs of the Loyalty Security Board hearing. But he had built the thing up so highly that it was, you know, sort of waiting for somebody to come along and look at it, and nobody wanted to bother.
Senator, what is the net result so far of your investigation into possible security leaks at Fort Monmouth?
I think perhaps one of the most encouraging things is that they know now that they have a Secretary of the Army who will back them up when they suspend communists and suspected espionage agents. In the past, many of the commanding generals, especially at Fort Monmouth, found that when they would suspend a man because of communist activities, because they thought he was an espionage agent.
Came back to the office and went in to see Russ Wiggins, who was the managing editor, and said that the accusations were completely thin, and there was no spy, no sign of any spy, anything like. So I said, but I must forewarn you of something. This is his big shot. I could never be absolutely sure, you know, how any of these things will go. And I said, he could put the Post in deep trouble if it turns out to have a hole in it. And he said, you know, don't worry about the Post. Let me worry about that. You go ahead and write the story. After the stories appeared, Bob Stevens, Secretary of the Army then, called a press conference. And I was really loaded for bear because, you know, I knew what each one of these cases were, and as I went through them, I realized that this was left over from the things that they could not be proved, that had no case against in loyalty security, and this was the debris that McCarthy was going to root through, and if nobody else was going to cover it, and that's what was happening.
And you started asking questions that the Secretary couldn't answer, and the rest of the press deferred to you, I understand.
Well, I wish I had a copy of that transcript, because what happened was, I must say, it was a brutal job on my part, because I was so furious with Stevens.
You're in a situation where the Secretary of the Army is standing there.
Getting beaten by me.
Getting beaten by you. He finally acknowledges that, in fact, there's no real evidence about any of these 33.
That's right, that's right.
And that's huge news, and that sets up the Army hearings, the famous...
Right. That's right.
I had a duty that before sundown, when we know of anyone serving the communist cause, we let the...
And the television coverage is actually not a small thing here. McCarthy had never been exposed on television. This was, I think this was the first time anyone saw him up close.
That's right, and been saying for years, arguing with my colleagues about that it was important to get McCarthy on television, because the public had to see what this operation was like, and see this fellow in action, and you know, the falsetto that he goes into, and it works. As a matter of fact, it was the biggest television event of its time. Anything that personalized, it had sort of a double shock effect.
Whether you knew that he was a member of that communist organization or not, I don't know. As a point of personal privilege, I'd like to finish this.
Senator,
Let's
you've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
As far as I am aware, no communist agent who was ever unearthed by Joe McCarthy.
After all that, all the names, all the lives that were ruined, that's all the hearings, all the investigations.
Absolutely none.
At that moment, covering McCarthy the way you did for 3 or 4 years, deep in the trench, I think it was 4 solid years, and it was intense beyond words, it sounds like. Long days, leaving at midnight, doing research, and you were an irritant to McCarthy and to his people just by doing your job, and it had to be enormously difficult and frustrating and rewarding simultaneously, I would think.
I would often be in the office till 10 or 11 o'clock at night trying to get somebody's response to a charge in the next edition of the paper. My colleague Phil Potter, he would say, well, what do you think we're accomplishing? I said, we have to operate on the premise, the only premise I know of, that if you keep putting enough light on a situation, that you'll hopefully have some consequence. Something will happen as a result of it. He said, what the hell do you think is going to happen out of this? I said, well, eventually people are going to see what this is like and be repelled by it if they understand what is happening. And well, what's that going to do to them? I said, well, that makes him a subject of ridicule. Well, who the hell? He doesn't care if anybody ridicules him or not. I said, yes, he will, because that if you have somebody whose stature is so degraded that way, eventually the time will come when he'll just sort of disappear and people will pay no attention to him.
Which is what happened. He drank himself to death.
Drank himself to death. He can only operate on the only journalistic premise that I know is that it has some effect. And if it doesn't have an effect, we should all be in the bottling business or something.
That's right.